But Maureen has published a paper that also shows an interesting diversion between the birds because eared grebes, 90% shrimp, that's the main thing they eat. Phalaropes do not eat shrimp.
Right.
Who knows why? Because they're there in the water column, but they don't eat them. They eat flies, larvae, and pupae of brine flies. So it's interesting in that you could use grebes as a sentinel species for how the shrimp population is doing, and you can use phalaropes, both species, as a sentinel for what brine fly populations are doing.
That would make it easier. In essence, that's what we've done there. The grebes are the bird for the pelagic, and we need to know that to be able to put in what's critical here in the benthic.
But John is right. Golden eyes, there's a bunch of them that overwinter on the Great Salt Lake or stay there in the fall, and they're diving and picking larvae and pupae off the chromatoids.
So one of the reasons I mentioned that is since the early 2000s, and Jim probably can attest to this just from observation, but even from our flights that we've been doing, midwinter flights, it seems like the goldeneye have consistently dropped off, and I wonder if that's because of the something going on there.
It's an interesting question.
On brine flies and microbialites, because I mean, the energy they get from that, typically those birds are feeding on mussels and things like that, and it seems like brine flies are not that, especially when they have to fight the saline waters to get down at depth. But we have, I mean, is that right, Jim? I mean, we're seeing far less.
Minuscule population compared to what
And they were, I mean, that I think was one of the findings was this was the largest wintering, inland wintering population of common goldeneye, even larger than the Great Lakes population at the time, over 40,000 here right in the middle of the winter. January and February were peak numbers, and now we're just not seeing that.
I don't
So
think
that's
it's correlated to larva though.
maybe not.
But that's why we're building this model, and
Yeah.
that's why this stuff needs to go into there.
Mike mentioned phalarope, that's more so adult glide. There was some in shallow that would, they can't dive.
Well, let's put it this way. There is a prediction that will come out of this in terms of adult flies as well.
Well, speaking of things changing, I've been looking at breeding records of ducks in the Great Salt Lake marshes. And before the floods in the 60s and 70s, there were a heck of a lot of redheads here. This was really the heart of the redhead breeding range. And I don't think we've ever seen a redhead. We've never found a redhead nest. You know, we've looked for, Mark's been out there, checked probably 1,000 nests total over the last couple of years, not a single redhead. I'm not sure what happened, but boy, that's a big change from thousands to zero.
Yeah.
Did we ever consider how many cysts were consumed by grebes?
Yes, I don't have that on the top of my head, but yes, we have
You
information.
published it.
Yeah,
But-
we published information.
Did we include that?
The numbers.
Not here, no. And it's, at this stage, at least with the grebes, that's not consequential in that case. Really?
Yeah,
There
although
was a back of the envelope calculation down, and I seem to remember we were talking about
Well, what they do, it's
more
not
than
so much
100
the
metric
cyst,
tons.
but they consume the adults in the fall. And so they are eliminating the adults, and they impact cyst production because, you know, they eat 25% of all of the adult brine shrimp. So they're affecting cyst production, but it's cyst production is not consuming the cyst per se. And most of the cysts they eat, we also did an experiment this year, most of the cysts they eat are digested. Some pass through 10%, but 90% of what grebes eat cyst-wise are digested.
Yeah, I didn't think that was a huge impact, but,
It can be added more. But let's move on here. Let's go to the next slide. This is why it's important to have these laboratory experiments independently looking at variables, because we're talking today about lake levels, to a great extent, concern about the dropping lake level. And if you plot lake level versus salinity, you get a good relationship. Duh, we all expect that, right? If you plot lake level versus inorganic nitrogen in the water, which is what's being used by the phytoplankton, you get a negative relationship as the lake level goes up. Both of those things are dilution effects. If we go to lake temperature, lake level has an effect on temperature. Two ways. It changes with the surface to volume area. The greater the surface to the volume, the warmer the water gets. Also, the denser the water gets, the warmer it gets. So these things are all tied together with changes in lake level. And I presented this here in terms of lake level in feet because that's what everybody talks about in the news. If I did regressions here or analyze this in terms of lake volume and surface to volume using the data we have on how those change in the lake with level, you get even better fits if you use actual volume and surface to volume. So the point is we cannot separate out the effects of salinity, temperature, and nitrogen for the growth of the phytoplankton. We can't separate those out from lake observations because they're intertwined. And that's why these lab experiments are so critical to building the model. So let's look at some of the output from the model here. Well, first, the model, there's two variants. There's a yearly test where you put in the numbers for the nitrogen, salinity, and temperature for each month in a given year. And then it tells you what the shrimp should look like, what the bird should look like, etc. And you can compare that with what was measured on the lake. This is the main test of the model. If this is working right, then we can make a 5-year forecast model, which is what managers want, is to forecast what the future is going to be on the lake. And that model has far more inputs to it. You have to take into account the hydrology of the lake, what's coming in from the various watersheds that feed the lake. You have to look at changes in temperature, air temperature, etc. And then you have to have starting conditions for your shrimp population. And then that'll make predictions for 1 year in the future. Then the next year, you have to add more watershed guesses at what you think is going to happen. That'll predict another year. You have to do it for the next year. And you're making these forecasts based upon what's going on. So that's the structure of the model. The output then is very similar. Here's the yearly output in the game. I call this a game, so you can play this to forecast things. And here's for the yearly conditions. Looks identical to the 5-year forecast model, except there's now 5 years. You can see the ups and downs going on over 5 years there. The actual math behind this and the graphs that are there are identical between the two, except the time period that's being proposed next. Okay, this is where I want to go, and that's where the model is, predicting things. Let's predict what is going on average from 2015 to 2020, 6-year period. Chlorophyll has a correlation coefficient of 0.98. Cysts have a correlation coefficient of 0.89. You can see how the blue line here is predicted. The red line is what was observed from the GSLEP data, and this is by month. Nuclei, correlation coefficient of 0.96. Juveniles, correlation coefficient of 0.96. Adults, a correlation of 0.89. The model on average for that 6-year period is doing great. I'm done. Okay? This is where I say, take the hat off, throw it on the table. We're done.
mic drop,
What?
mic drop.
Yeah. Let's look at each of the 6 years individually. Next slide.
We did have a question.
Okay,
Krishna wants to know, what about the effects of the bidirectional flow, as the regression seems only for the south arm?
I'm going to get to that later on in the
Okay.
talk, when I talk about sensitivity and elasticity analysis of the model. Okay, so let me put that off.
Okay.
But just say the bidirectional flow is going on, and you're asking the question, how is salinity changing? How is nitrogen as the lake volume changes? So those numbers of the bilateral flow are built into the observations there. The specifics of that I'll talk about later. Next. Okay, annual results. So here's 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. SIFs. On the average, were predicted with 0.89 correlation coefficient. The average over the number of years, the 6 years, is 0.82. So the fit is not as good on a yearly basis as on the 6-year average. Nauplii goes from 0.96 down to 0.77. Juveniles go from 0.96 down to 0.71. Adults go from 0.89 down to 0.86. And chlorophyll goes from 0.98 down to 0.79. Specific annual predictions are not as good as averaged over a period of time. They're still not bad. The reason. Let's take any one year, and this is not to be negative on what GSLEP is doing in terms of their sampling.
That's really good for 200 micron specs. 1,700 per mile. Anyway.
Yeah, don't get defensive. The problem is very simply what the model is predicting. Here's the model output by week. So let's take this week here, which is the Nauplii hatch. So, or no, this is juveniles. So I've got marked. So if you went out only over 2 weeks, you'd hit this day, and you'd hit this day. And what is the model doing? It's saying, oh, that month there is averaged out. And so you're smoothing all of this out on a monthly basis. The sampling that's going on in the lake, I don't want to say is hit or miss, but you're not sampling over a smooth extended period. So by averaging over a number of years, you're essentially filling in a lot more points in there and smoothing things out. And that's why the 6-year running at 6-year average that I present is much better than each individual year. It's the problem of having to sample temporally over time. Can you go back? Yeah, okay, I got it. Next one. Okay, let's look at predictions over that 6-year period of phytoplankton composition. Warning here, this is a log plot. So that means that up at this end, the variability in your measurements is way down. And as you go down the line here, your variability of your measurement goes way up. But I used a log plot so I could get everything onto one graph. The correlation coefficient without using the log is 0.99 on composition of cyanophyte, bacillariophyte, and chlorophyte. It's working really great in terms of the phytoplankton shifts. On the yearly value, you can see the scatter has increased versus the average, but it's still a correlation coefficient of 0.99. So we got this phytoplankton down. The shrimp look to be down for the pelagic side. Next. Well, what do you get for the preliminary data for the microbialites? Microbialite abundance, we don't have enough data from the lake on actual microbialite dynamics and abundance, but it's looking pretty good. Correlation of 0.72. So we got 4 measures for December to March from 2015 to 2020, 2 measures for the month of May, 4 measures for the month of June, and 4 measures for August. That's all we have. But it's looking pretty good. We need to get some microbial measurements, more of them on a regular basis. Larvae on the microbial correlation coefficient of 0.95. But you can see there's a lot of, you're undercounting in a lot of the months. And again, there's not much measurement. This is all my PhD student Kate's sampling on the lake. That's all we basically have. And then here's the pupil counts, much poorer correlation of 0.68. Remember, as I was talking before everybody showed up, this is based upon consumption of the microbial based upon the only brine fly study that I was able to find, not the same species as the lake, but a hot springs Yellowstone species in the 60s where they radioisotope tagged the algae in the hot spring and then measured consumption. And that was under one set of temperature conditions. But that's the best that's available out there, and this is where our lab is trying to get that consumption data. But based upon this predicts there should be 25,000 flies per meter squared of shoreline in August. And that's right up in the range of what Don Paul and others have estimated for what's on the lake. So the benthic side of things is doing pretty good. We have nothing there on birds.
If it's shoreline, why is that meter square?
Because it's a density. You can't measure something in terms of a single distance measure. So it has to be a density measure.
But then it seems like you're arbitrary in how wide you think a beach is or a shore is.
That's exactly right. You're right, Mike, but that's the only thing you can do. We can predict how many are emerging. You could do that. And you could test that with putting emergence traps out there in the water.
I would just have thought that it would be easier to determine the length of the shoreline without having and then doing it number of flies per meter of shoreline versus meter square, which means you have to do something about depth.
Well,
the width of the shore itself.
Yeah, right now, you're absolutely correct. And what it is, it's the meters of the shoreline, 1 meter in. So that's all I did there. So it's essentially what you're saying.
And for your 2 graphs here of larvae, how the densities are changing per month, is that, I'm not sure where that data is. Is that your data, or is the Great Salt Lake Project, does that come from them?
No, it's data from my Kate Barrett and I got.
I'm sorry?
Kate Barrett, my PhD student,
So she goes out on the lake
and scrapes off the microbialites and counts up all the larvae. Yeah.
I've often wondered what those values were. That's what we're doing it.
That's what we got.
That's how she got
But
out. We took her out.
you took her out there, yeah.
Bless your heart.
Does she wear scuba?
Bless your heart, yeah.
Does she do this with scuba gear?
No, she had a suction device.
Oh, that's cheating.
It's in
I
our
saw her
lab.
with a scraper, actually scrape these things off.
She did after, yeah, well, or you had to pull them out get them out of the microbialite biofilm that she was getting.
Bless her.
We have the contraption at Westminster. Our students were helping her a lot.
Yeah.
And every time somebody goes in the field room, they raise up this like PVC. It's like really big and long, and it kind of slides. What is this?
We have another one in my lab, yeah.
Yeah, it's very creative.
So anyway, let's look at 2011, last year, because everybody was concerned with what last year was going to look like. So the model predictions versus observed is for chlorophyll, a correlation of 0.78. Cysts are not good with 0.44. But let me point out here, fix this 1 month here, which was way high. We were talking about this. GSLEP's measurement is high. The industry's measurement is much lower and more in tune with what the model is predicting for that 1 month. That 1 month, if you bring it down to where the model is predicting, the R value goes up to somewhere between 0.7 and 0.8. So that 1 month measurement throws everything off. Nauplii is off with a correlation of 0.44, and that's simply because the GSLEP sampling of the lake last year missed the hatch of the cysts on the lake. So when we get this predicted peak here, they had already hatched. The GSLEP didn't hit that. And so we're not taking into account both the hatching and the appearance of live young that would have been going on. But then as we go to juveniles, R goes to 0.96, and for adults, we're at 0.95. So it's doing pretty well on an average basis.
What year result is that?
2011, last year. No,
21.
2021, sorry.
That's okay,
Was it 2011 on the slide? Okay, sorry, 21.
Use it live.
Thanks for reminding me. Write that down, because these slides will be used for the Friends of the Great Salt Lake meeting to a certain extent.
Well, when you give this speech again, make sure you give me credit for pointing out.
I will, Mike. I will.
You know how to spell my last name correctly?
Yeah, I think so, Mike.
Yeah. Just wanted to make sure.
Okay. Let's take the model and do one other projection. Let's do the harvest model that we published. That's the 21, 25, 26 cysts per liter, right? This is what we empirically measured and published. That's being used for management of the harvest. This is what the 2015 through 2020 data predicts. Not bad. Does pretty good. And don't forget, this 2015 through 2020 is a much narrower range of salinities, temperatures, and phytoplankton abundances than we had in the actual field observation data. So anyway, there's another test of how good that pelagic part of the model is working. Next. Okay, let's talk about sensitivity analysis. Sensitivity analysis is saying over the range of observations that you have for the lake, how much does a particular variable, how is it projected to change what's going on? So let's start with nitrogen. Let the model say, since 1994 through 2011, nitrogen is varied by this amount. How much did all the other biological variables change with that nitrogen? Well, as you would expect, as nitrogen increased in the lake, chlorophyll A is predicted to increase. The star there is for the average of the, that's for the average value of 95 to 2020. The red bar here is the range that was observed. We look at the abundance, maximum abundance in any 1 month, the peak abundance of nauplii, juveniles, and adults. You can see nauplii increased dramatically with more nitrogen there, very simply. More food. Adults increase slightly. Juveniles are unaffected. And that's because juveniles are much more affected by the salinity and the temperature than they are by food. We see this in our experiments in the lab, and we had anticipated that from the 94 through 2006 lake data that we published. Interestingly, what do you get for maximum cyst production? You get a saw blade. What is the model predicting? Well, if you have low food, what does the shrimp do? They don't produce live young, they only produce cysts. Boom, way up the cyst count goes. As food becomes more abundant, the shrimp go through, say, some moderate level of food abundance. The shrimp go through producing live young, and then as they deplete the food resource down, they then shift to making cysts. If food is highly abundant, up in this end, only live young are produced. Cysts, not much in the way of cysts is produced. Why you get this saw blade. They're shifting how they're distributing their reproductive efforts.
So with the high number of nuclei, but smaller number of juveniles and adults, does that indicate low survivability?
Repeat again.
Does that indicate low survivability from nuclei to juveniles?
Yes,
Okay, just wondering.
yes. Okay, well, let's go back and
Right.
point something out on this, the nitrogen here. Nitrogen varied by 87.5% between the low and the high over the study, the GSLEP study. Next.
Wait, before you go, on the y-axis, this is the yearly production of cysts?
Maximum that was observed in the fall.
Maximum amount of all.
And let's look at temperature. We got nitrogen now and salinity constant. We're varying temperature only in the model. Temperature varied only from 94 to 2020 by 24.2%. Temperature has virtually no effect on the shrimp. As temperature increases, you slightly get a decrease in chlorophyll, but it's not a big effect. And you see, this is the effect on the cyst production. And this is what this thing, they're largely in just doing the normal thing we're used to seeing, making live young and then switching to cysts later on after they deplete with the phytoplankton. Next. Okay, now let's look at salinity. Salinity is varied from 1994 to 2020 values. Temperature and nitrogen are now constant. Salinity has two effects that I'm going to talk about. I didn't know this in December when we were talking. Salinity has a direct effect on the biota. It also has an effect on the shrimp in terms of when they hatch, when those cysts hatch in the spring. The saltier the water, the later in the year they tend to hatch. And that has an effect. So projections I made here were based upon, let's not consider the hatching time, hold hatching time constant, and let's vary hatching time. You can see that adults and juveniles, we don't get a lot of variability with salinity. We don't get much variability with the nuclei either, but you can see hatching time does have an effect on the nuclei. Salinity tends to increase chlorophyll in the lake. And that's very simply that all of the production tends to be shifting over to Denaliella as the salinity increases. And Denaliella is more productive. And here's what the effect is on cyst production. And you can see there's a big jump, but it's still staying in that moderate level here. You can see a phytoplankton are going to be moderately abundant, and you're going from producing live young to shifting to cysts. Okay, so you're looking at this and say, wow, salinity has a big effect. But salinity, when we talk about sensitivity analysis, we're interested not only in how much the salinity changed the value, but how much did you observe salinity to change? So let's look at just what is going on here without considering how much the value of that environmental variable changed. Next. So in sensitivity analysis, you can see that nitrogen is most important for nuclei. Nitrogen is most important for adults. Nitrogen is second in importance. In cis production, salinity is the most important variable. Nitrogen is most important for chlorophyll A. Salinity comes in second in 1, 2, 3 cases. Temperature comes in last in all 4 of these cases here. But we haven't taken into account how much the temperature vary. Because if you look at here, the variability observed over the study by GSLEP, we can see nitrogen and salinity, the red and the green, vary comparably. Why? Because it's a dilution effect in the lake. If you have the same amount of water, you're going to dilute nitrogen the same way as you dilute salinity. Temperature hardly varied or didn't vary to a great extent at all. So you might get little variation in the effective temperature, but that's because temperature didn't vary much. So you need to express these on a per change basis here to how much the variable changed. And that's your elasticity analysis. So here's elasticity. Lake level goes down, salinity goes up, temperature goes up, nitrogen goes up. Chlorophyll A, salinity has a positive effect, temperature has a negative effect, salinity has a positive effect. We can add all these up and it gives us a measure of the relative importance of each of these variables on the change that we're seeing in the biotic variable. And here now, what we see is nitrogen's better or has a bigger effect than salinity, but salinity and temperature are almost identical. So the effective temperature rises because it's creating a much bigger change relative to how much it changes. Everybody got that? We can look at the role of on the nuclei, and we can see how salinity affects it, how temperature affects the nuclei. Boom, look at that. 84 is the value for nitrogen. Nitrogen is way more important than salinity, and salinity and temperature are again about equal. We go to adults, come down. Nitrogen is definitely most important. Nitrogen much greater than temperature, much greater than salinity, and salinity and temperature can shift with when this, because salinity also has an effect on when the hatching week occurs. Cis. Salinity is important, temperature turns out to be equally important, and nitrogen is not far off. But we go now, salinity and temperature are equal, and they're greater than nitrogen. Let's look at the grebes. In the grebes here, salinity is least important, temperature is not terribly important, but certainly nitrogen is very important. Nitrogen is important because that gives them more food in terms of the shrimp to eat. So nitrogen is greater than salinity or temperature, and if we take in hatching time, which would affect the grebes when the shrimp hatch, salinity and temperature are about equal. We go to microbialites here, we see that temperature, salinity is important, temperature is more important, and nitrogen is least important. Nitrogen is still important. Let me tell you why. There's something built into this. You dilute the nitrogen there, you have some base amount of nitrogen in the lake. You dilute that with the water column. That's what gives you the pelagic nitrogen. What's left for the microbialites on the bottom? What didn't get put up into the water column. So if more goes into the water column, there's less for the microbialites. And here we see temperature is critical to the microbialites. Salinity is second in importance, and nitrogen is the least important. This is your Since, your elasticity analysis, yeah.
So the elasticity analysis was done over what salinity range now?
The whole salinity range,
Which
from
would,
94 to 2020. So let's go back one slide.
which spanned what salinity?
So you would take this value here for nitrogen effect. That's the nitrogen effect. That's the sensitivity. Okay?
So the average salinity never, from when did you say? From?
94 to 2020.
Okay. So from somewhere around 7% to maybe
Go back one more.
16%.
8.8%
Okay.
up to 16.3%. Okay? Let's go forward again.
Okay, before you go past that slide,
Okay, back.
right there, why isn't grebes and adult brine shrimp? I would have expected them to be similar.
In absolute values?
Like I would have, you have here different variables that are affecting adult shrimp, either plus or minus. I would have expected the same relationship to occur for grebes since they're eating primarily adults.
You're trying to put on this absolute values. This is not an absolute value. This is just telling you the strength of that influence. You notice plus and plus. That's the key.
But one of them, a couple of them is like plus and minus.
That's right. They'll shift. So there's a plus and minus for salinity, right? The plus is don't consider when the nuclei hatch. The minus says, oh, look what happens when you consider that the nuclei are delayed in hatching because of high salinity. Okay? Think of it this way. The longer you're floating out there as a cyst, what's happening to you? There's mortality on you. So the longer you wait, the higher the mortality on the cyst stage. And that's built into the mortality of cysts we built in, and we have that measured. Okay, let me wrap up. Let's use the model now for a management purpose, which is the reason for this model. Forecast what could happen. Now remember, this is preliminary. All right, let's assume salinity can be kept constant by managing the inflow of salt from the north arm into the south arm of the lake. Okay? So we start controlling the bidirectional flow. And of course, that has been presented as a management strategy. We discussed it in December, and I know it's being seriously thought about now. What's going to be the effect? So what you're doing there is you're holding the salinity essentially constant. I know you can't hold it constant, but for purposes of this discussion, I'm saying you are holding it constant. You're holding it constant, but what are you doing? What's happening still to the lake level? It's still going down. Okay? So salinity is now held constant. Lake level is going down, which means nitrogen goes up and temperature goes up. So if we allowed the salinity to vary, our elasticity value for phytoplankton would be plus 54, nuclei plus 72, adults plus 72, cysts minus 60, grebes plus 114. These are not constant, these are relative rankings of things. And microbialites really get hammered, minus 133. Let's now hold salinity constant. We're changing the inflow from the north arm. And now what happens as the lake level goes down with temperature and nitrogen? Well, the phytoplankton, instead of increasing by a plus 54, is increasing by plus 11, which means the increase of phytoplankton in the lake goes down by 80%. That is a percentage value. Nauplii, about the same. There's no effect on the nauplii. If they increase by now only about 10% from letting salinity continue to vary. Adults decrease by 57%. Cis go from a -60 to a -159, which is a decline that's increased by 165%. Cis really get hammered. Our grebes go from 114 to a +166. They improve by about 46%. Microbialites don't get saved, but they don't get hammered as badly. -133, hold salinity constant, it becomes a -88. Their decline diminishes by a -34%. This just, what I wanted to say, this gives you a rough idea of what a management strategy is going to do on the lake. Yeah.
And this is interesting, but I think the management strategy is not that everybody is trying to keep salinity constant, but that what we're trying to do is keep salinity between bookends that are critical. Because at a higher salinity, at some point we just discussed that we may have that precipice go over that cliff,
Yeah.
or vice versa, if it goes too low.
Right.
And so, it would be interesting once you've added the higher salinity values to your modeling, to see how that elasticity changes if you can keep the salinity within those bookends based on the model.
Yeah, let me just point out, first of all, survivorship for the shrimp and everything is going down with salinity on average. It's just whether it goes down gradually or if there's a cliff someplace.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is taking into account there's a negative salinity effect, but not over the cliff. That might be the case. Probably is the case.
And it takes into account a negative salinity effect up to what salinity?
Right
to the
now, I'm saying you're
16%.
holding it at 21. Okay? That's all I'm, but there's a lot of games that can be played with this, with the model. I just took this as an example of what.
No, it's a great example. I'm just saying it'd be nice if over time we could apply it, to the example that we're trying to simulate.
These guys get to do it when they get the model.
Because I think that would be more relevant.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I just use this as an example
Yeah, no, I get it.
of how you can use this from a management perspective. So, but the important thing here is that, can we go back? In 3 cases, we got better by doing it. We countered the effect. And in 3 cases, 3 cases got better and 3 cases got worse. So it's not just one way, it's going to improve things. Okay, there's one other thing that's not included in this, is that as you change the volume of the lake, that's also going to further change the abundance of cis for harvesting. And it's going to expose the microbialites. As the water level falls, they're exposed. And that's going to be further negative things. And you can take that into account given the volume and surface to volume relationships that we know are taking places in the lake. Oh, let's go back to that then. The point here is that salinity is not the sole driving factor. And in fact, in every case we're looking at, except for cis, salinity is not the most important driving factor when we look at sensitivity and elasticity. Everybody assumes that a hypersaline lake, because it is so rough on biota, and very little can live there, except under those that are adapted to those extreme conditions, that the biology of the ecosystem must be driven by salinity. Well, it may be salinity may be driving who the players are in the game, in the ecosystem. But because they're adapted to high salinity, under a lot of the conditions that you're going to have, salinity may not vary that much to have that big an impact on them. Temperature and nitrogen may be more important. So we need to be very careful when we talk about the role of salinity. Because if we manage for salinity, it's possible other things continue to change and they were more important to begin with.
Yeah, but I think we need to be very careful to say that salinity is not important.
I didn't say it's not important.
Because at a certain salinity, you're going to get predators which will,
We
take
got
your
that,
branching
and at the
population
other
away.
extreme, you got the North Arm where nothing, other than bacteria, all dies, everything dies off.
But within a certain range, the range that we've seen so far, salinity doesn't seem to play as a significant role.
Correct.
Which, if you look at the cyst count over the years and you look at the population over the years, that seems to correlate.
Right. But let me just point out here, that is the purpose of building this model. Because we can't see what is going to happen in the future. We need to forecast what's going to happen in the future. And that's what the model allows you to do. All I can tell you right now, given the range of conditions we've seen since 94 to 2020, this is how the importance of each of these factors is on the dynamics of the system.
I can't wait, Gary, until you have those higher salinity results of your research. Because I think, that is where it becomes really useful to run that model at really high salinities.
Because that's the
Because-
variable that you can change or
Yeah.
supposedly change. I think but it does emphasize how important the nitrogen or the nutrients are too.
Let me make a different argument here. And this is what I think, and I've said this for many years in EPA meetings and things like that, when we're talking about toxicity of chemicals in the lake. And I said concentration is the important thing, and that requires water. I think, you could manage for salinity and the lake still disappears on you. I think that it's harder to manage for the water to get to be most important because everything is changing with water level. And I'm just saying we need to be cautious that just because we can manage one thing, and that's good as a Band-Aid right now, but in the long run, that's not going to solve the problem.
But if the lake is truly nutrient limited, then even at a lower volume, the nutrients could concentrate and still produce a similar amount of biomass.
That's what the sensitivity analysis is taking into account. More phytoplankton, you're getting more biomass of what is out there in a volume. Remember, your volume now is getting down. And at some point, the volume gets down to 1 cubic meter. You could have great cyst production in that cubic meter, right? But it's not going to be of any value to you for the industry.
Yeah, of course.
Or the birds.
Of course, but I think the argument I'm trying to make is that as long as the lake is nutrient limited, then a decrease in volume can still result in a similar amount of biomass being produced. Once you start to go beyond where the lake is not nitrogen or phosphorus limited anymore, then a decrease in volume becomes an issue.
Okay. I just want to be really clear here. These sensitivity and elasticity measurements that I'm making are based in the pelagic on a per liter basis.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? You could get huge increase in phytoplankton production on a per liter basis. But as you also are shrinking the lake, you have less out there.
Yeah, that's exactly the argument I'm making.
Yeah.
You can have a higher concentration at a lower volume. But at some point, there's a limit.
but that
can only sustain so much.
Right. That's the problem. Exactly. And as far as the microbialites and the fly larvae, that's being based on a meter squared basis. Because it's the bottom.
So if you ran this out in time, does that increase in cyst production change since they're hatching lowers?
Okay. When that requires the 5-year forecast model to do
Okay.
that, okay? And the 5-year forecast model requires you to put in each year's what you think the hydrology is going to be for that year, the water runoff, okay? I've run it 5 years into the future, assuming that the runoff is the same. Okay?
Mhm.
And what you see is the changes in that first year, and then it stays there pretty much. It may go up and down a little bit, but it stays pretty level.
Just interesting because it would, since they would produce more cysts if conditions aren't right, it makes sense that the conditions in the lake would have less of an effect on the adults than you would think because they're not going to hatch unless it's a better condition. So over time, you would think there would be less adults to produce cysts.
It may go down a little bit over time, but not a lot. And in fact, you can see it that some years it goes up a little bit, even under the same conditions. And then the next year it comes down and up and down a little bit. So it's not a constant, it fluctuates.
Okay. We do have a couple of questions. Krishna asked why average values were considered during the sensitivity analysis rather than considering the possible minimum and maximum values.
Average values weren't being considered. The star that was there was just to show what the average was over the period.
Okay.
The values were computed on each of the extreme, the whole range. So I took a 10% change over the entire range and ran the model.
And then Ann Neville, with the microbialite decline, does that include the desiccation of them or just the salinity?
That includes both temperature and salinity being detrimental to the growth of microbialites. That last calculation, if you go to the last slide, takes in the added effect of the surface to volume changing and exposing them further.
Okay, that's all the questions.
I have one from Bonnie. She
Oh.
texted in the chat.
Okay.
Bonnie can't chat.
What?
That's what I just said.
Are you
Bonnie
kidding
can't
me?
chat.
Oh, I can be sometimes.
Oh,
And it's
good.
It keeps me great to it. I'm curious what Gary's lab experiments and data look like for the release of microbialite gnat microbes during grazing or wind. We found the same microbes in the water immediately surrounding the microbialite DNA analysis. Did we have other data showing the same?
We have data that shows that months that on average are windier, the cyanophyte and the bacillarial phyte counts in the lake go up. Those are the species that are on the microbialite. We know wind is having an effect. Some people disagree with that conclusion, but we see wind does have an effect on that. We do know that we watched the larvae feed on microbialite, and we know that they're sloppy feeders. We have not quantified that yet. And we can do that because we have the tile with the microbialite growing on it. We can put the flies on it in the lab, and we know that the water above is we can see if the abundance of the microbialite cyanophytes and bacillariophytes increases as the larvae feed.
I'm writing that in my book. Flies are sloppy eaters.
They are. They are. They're sloppy eaters.
What temperature range did you look at when you were studying this, doing the lab experiments?
5 to 30. And for the sensitivity analysis, what I'm presenting is the average water temperature of the lake for the year. Okay, but once it goes into the model, that average is broken down on an expected monthly change in temperature.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand what the effect is of a temperature change within a year. As the temperature goes down, does that increase the cyst production? Does it not? If you keep in the model, how is that?
The way the model is set up from the lab experiments is that food and temperature lead to them shifting to more cyst production. So if they deplete the food and as temperature increases, they shift to cyst production.
And when temperature decreases?
As long as there's plenty of phytoplankton, they stay in live young production. The results of the sensitivity analysis for changing salinity and everything, those predictions fit exactly what Kate Barrett and I published in your guys' book on what we projected for climate change. They're right in line with those predictions. And those were based upon lake observations, not the laboratory experiments. There's a lot changing in this, and it's keeping track of it. And now the model is dealing with temperature on a weekly basis, not on a monthly basis, so it's changing weekly. That happened. Not all the cysts hatch at the same time. It's 30% hatch in the first week. Of those that remain, 70% hatch in the second week, and of those that remain, 100% hatch in the third week. And that's what we got from laboratory experiments. That's built in now. Of course, that's going to vary from year to year, but we don't know how that's going to happen. And the rough figure for how soon the cysts hatch is given that we had variable salinity in the experiment. I looked at that and tried to build it in as best as I could. But that's where we're at. But it's ready for you guys to at least play with the the pelagic part.
Yeah, we look forward to doing that. Although I think the answers that we get from the predictions are probably what we want to see. So,
I can't help that.
because of the no water thing.
I can't help that one. But that is the problem. As you change lake level, everything changes with it. All these things are interrelated. They're not independent variables. Anything else?
Any more questions after all that work you put into it? All right, we'll shift over to Kyle's going to present the demographics for the shrimp. Okay, next.
Yeah, so demographics for the shrimp, really just the first third of this is going to be the most interesting because unfortunately we just haven't gotten warm enough temperatures yet. You can see we had the above average January, but the below average March. So this black line is the 20-year average, 99 to 21. And then you can see this 22, this year's average versus this overall average. So this 1.9 is going to be on the red line, whereas this 0.9 is going to be the black line. All of the multicolored lines in the background are the years from 99 up to 2021. Just so you can see some of the variability that creates this black line. So moving into chlorophyll production. So we've seen this odd case where we were up around 21 in December and the bottom fell out in January, which is odd because there's no shrimp there grazing. But as you'll see in the next slide, we're at that peak of salinity. So if we go back to this one. So we're still trying to figure out what's causing this, but it is an effect that we've seen in previous years where we'll bottom out in December, January, and then rebound quite quickly in February before the shrimp hatch. So there's something that Gary's trying to look at, we're trying to look at. We haven't pinned that down quite yet, but it's not too alarming because it is something we have seen and the shrimp are able to recover. It's a phytoplankton is quite resilient to most things. You can see the averages for 2022 versus the averages overall. And, you know, we were a little low coming in, but we've right back to just a little bit above average currently. This does represent only one run for March, so January and February each have multiple runs. March is only one run. Just due to weather and scheduling, haven't made it out on lake the second time. So looking at salinity, we are kind of the upper bounds that we've ever seen. This green line that you can see, it's right there under the red, that is 2004. So lake was quite a bit higher, but we have seen high salinities in the past. If you follow that green line out, it is the highest running summertime salinity that we have currently. Although, you know, with our current runoff situation, we probably expect this to run similar, if not maybe above that, which is quite scary. I think that's the concern that Thomas and everybody in this room has currently. Looking at our 2022 versus the overall average, you can see just how much higher this year is than our running 20. So if we move into the cyst density currently, we had that excess of cysts that we'll get to in September. It was just these really odd high counts that Gary mentioned that's kind of messing with his model currently. You can see January, we were still quite high this year compared to the overall average, but you know, harvest and everything was able to knock those back down to where this is kind of the first year in the last 5 years that we expect to be on that density independent side of the predictive model. So that might be a nice change for a minute and not worried about too many shrimp hatching all at once and raising everything down. So we're kind of set up for a nice situation this year for as bad as everything is. Moving on. The rest of these slides are going to be really boring because we haven't captured the hatch yet. So with that first run in March, we had 7 sites that showed up at 0.01, but they didn't reflect in the overall average across the 17. So we're still showing a 0, even though we know the Nalboy have hatched. We haven't been out to collect that data, so we don't have that quantified just yet. But we know they've hatched with the record daytime temps that were set over the weekend. The lake's got to be warming up.
It was warmed up.
It was warmed up, yeah. So we expect to see hatching. We just haven't made it out. We were hoping to get out this week, hopefully tomorrow, maybe Monday, and then we'll capture that hatching. So the rest of these, if we don't have juveniles, we no Nalboy, no juveniles, no adults. Where we are. Any questions?
Great. We'll shift over to Ryan and Christine.
Did you want to jump into, we can start, or were we gonna talk, is there gonna be another conversation before?
Well, I was, except for Riley's not here yet, so we'll wait till he shows up. He had another meeting that until 11, so I'm not sure where that was, so it may take him a little while to get here. So we'll pick up with that after you get done, and then it'll be time for lunch.
Perfect. Let's
Okay.
get it loaded up here.
Showing up yet.
While we're waiting, Jamie, do you want to make any announcement on the state crustacean or anything?
Yeah, it was really disappointed that the state crustacean bill did not
Tags.
pass. It did not fail though, they just didn't get to it. I think
Some of the
they
slides
needed
have
to
animations, so we'll ask
issue
you to-
instead of,
Oh,
like,
then
registering.
do you mind if I put it on my
So,
desktop
next year.
so I can use my mouse?
It just was
Okay.
a matter
year.
of time.
It's just a matter of time.
Let's see if I can eject it.
Well, I mean,
Hold on, it takes like
it's
1
gonna
minute.
have like eagles and
I
red
know.
shrimp like can't compete with eagles or spiral jetty rock art, and so. State crustacean, we will be the only state, inland state with a state crustacean. This is important.
I was pretty bummed about that. Okay. This,
Just waiting to get in the presentation mode.
yeah,
All right.
okay, it's shared.
All
Looks
right.
like everyone can see it.
Thank you very much. So Christine and I are going to tag team the talk today. We have a team in our office that devotes a considerable amount of time to Great Salt Lake. So we just want to list them, and just so you guys are aware, we put together a nice team helping out on the lake. So there's a photo of Bear River Bay outflow in 2021 of July. Not much outflow happening there. Next slide. We're going to go over lake elevations. We're going to look at the inflow discharge values. We'll look at the water quality monitoring that we do on inflows and in lake. And then we'll touch on the FY 2023 work plan, which we're developing as we speak, and we'll share with the tag, obviously, once we wrap up the plan. So here's our gauge data for lake elevation at Saltaire Boat Harbor. I'm showing the last 3 years. As of March 28th, the average daily value was 4191.0. We're down about 1.8 feet from this time last year. And we're only up 0.8 of a foot from the historic low that we set in October of 2021. And everybody's aware of this, and we're all watching this really closely. But we're entering in our period now where there's the battle between evaporation and inflows, and we really need a better runoff than I think we're going to get. But we're going to watch that real close. I'm not going to give you a prediction here on how much I think the lake is going to increase, because I'll get in trouble if I'm wrong. Yeah. So here's the same information for our gauge on the north arm of the lake. The shape of that plot's very similar. As of March 28th, we were at 4190.5. We're down a similar amount, about 1.7 feet from a year ago. And then the historic low at this site was actually set in September of 2016 at 4189.0. And that's related to the culverts being shut down and the new breach not being completed. That just gives you a sense where we are relative to the record on the north arm. And again, we're going to be watching that really closely to see if we end up getting close to the historic low in September. Hopefully we don't. And then just a reminder on our monitoring for inflows. So we have continuous discharge data at the Weaver River, Farmington Bay outflow, Goggin Drain, and then the old breach. And we make periodic discharge measurements at the Bear River Bay outflow bridge and at the new breach. Okay, so those are approximately monthly measurements for the periodic sites. And we know how important the flow data is. And so the map gives you a sense of where see the old breach, new breach, the yellowish squares to give you a sense of where those sites are located. Next slide, please. All right, let's just talk a little bit about the inflows so far this year. So we're going to look at the Bear River Corinne. This gauge is a little bit upstream, but it's the closest continuous discharge site we have to Great Salt Lake that is on the Bear River. This has a long record. So here I'm showing the cumulative stream flow at this site in millions of acre feet. And this is showing water year 2021. And that's actually the black line on the plot. So we have the time going from October out to September. The black line is indicating the cumulative flow for the 2021 water year. The orange line is the lowest observed cumulative flow at this site, which was actually in 1992. The blue line is the highest observed cumulative flow, which is 84. And then the green shaded area is kind of your average range, your normal range, 25th to 75th percentile range. The black line at the end of the year, water year, is well below the average range, and we're just a little bit above the low, the record cumulative flow low measured there. Now, if you hit the next button, I've just brought in the current water year, and then please hit next again and again. Let's just zone in on March of last year on the top plot compared to March of this year on the bottom plot, and that's what the red circle is circling for you. And you can see our black line in 2022 on the bottom plot is actually a little bit lower for this time of year than it was a year ago. So this is quite concerning. So in other words, up to this point, we have not had as much water pass that gauge as compared to last year. So we're going to have to keep a really close watch on this as this runoff plays out. Next slide. So same story, same set up here for the Weaver River near Plain City, another major inflow gauge. So on the top is the 2021 plot. The black line you can see is near the yellow line. So we had a really poor cumulative runoff last year. It was near the historic low. Yep, we hit next a couple of times, bringing the red circles. And you can see that this year on the bottom plot is actually a little bit worse than we were last year in terms of cumulative flows. So same story on the Weaver River. We've not had as much water pass this gauge at this point compared to last year. Next slide. Okay, it's the same situation, Gog and drain. You just go ahead and hit next. And next a few more times to see the red circle circling March. And on the bottom plot for the current water year, the black line is just right at the 25th percentile, the bottom of the green shaded area. And if you go up to the top plot, that's pretty close to where we were last year. So for Gog and drain, we're looking pretty similar to where we were last year. And then Farmington Bay outflow, because this site has reverse flow, positive and negative discharge values, the cumulative plots of the flow plots that I showed you won't work at that site. So all I'm providing here is flow for the water year in the October 1st to the current day, shown with the blue line on the plot. And then the yellow line is the median average daily value, and that's based on 14 years of data. So I can't really say, I haven't done the math, can't really say if we're up or down at this site compared to last year, but you can see in the plot, we have many areas where the blue line is significantly, so the current water year's data is significantly above the median of the yellow line. And then there are periods where we're below. We'll have to do the math on this one, but things aren't looking absolutely devastating just from my quick, eyeball analysis of the Farmington Bay flows in terms of, are we super low relative to previous years? And then, we make these periodic discharge measurements at the Bear River Bay outflow bridge. So downstream of the Corinne gauge. This is just a table that I pull in from INWISC. Everybody has access to this data. It's very easy to pull this, and you can see the discharge measurements we have and the dates they were made. But the whole reason we're doing this, and we want to continue doing these measurements at this outflow site, is to get a handle on how much is actually making, how much water from the Bear River is actually making it into the south arm. And so if you hit next and next again, here I'm just plotting the continuous or average daily values measured at the Corinne gauge. Those are shown with the solid blue line, and then those red squares are those periodic discharge measurements made at the Causeway Bridge. And you can see the red squares are following the same trends as the Corinne gauge, as we would expect. The whole idea here is to try to develop as robust a correlation between the two sites as we possibly can. That's a complicated thing to do, though, because at the Bear River Bridge, right where the lake is, basically, the flows there are impacted by wind events, etc. So it's a complicated thing. But the more discharge data we can get at that bridge, the better. And some of you who have been around in this group for a while know we tried to run a continuous discharge gauge at the bridge for a couple of years, but it turned out to be way too difficult. Sediment would blow away the equipment, and we just could not produce a good quality record. So we're left with making these periodic discharge measurements right now. And then here's just some data from our friends at NRCS showing the snowpack situation as of March 29th. This is snow water equivalent for the major basins in Utah. And you can see the very important Bear River Basin as of March 29th was at 69% of the median at that site. So that's a little bit of a concern. And then the Weber-Ogden drainage, very similar. Many of the basins that are important to Great Salt Lake are showing a snow water equivalent in terms of the snowpack that is well below the median. So we'll have to see how this plays out. New breach flow monitoring. Again, we're making those monthly discharge measurements. We have, in addition to that, many sensors. So we have Lake elevation sensors on the north and the south side of the causeway near the breach. We have weather sensors. We have an ADCP that's sitting on the bottom in the center of the channel at the new breach. It's looking up and it's measuring velocity vectors at various locations throughout the water column. And this data is being used with the USU modeling group and Craig Miller and Krishna and others to help come up with an estimate of discharge on a continuous basis at this new breach to kind of supplement, the discrete discharge measurements we make. It's all just an effort to quantify as best we can how much water is moving in both directions at that site. So that's a pretty big effort. So just a reminder that there's quite a bit of monitoring happening at the new breach to try to get these flows as best we can. Next slide. All right, so this shows the discrete discharge measurements that we make at the new breach. We have discharge in cubic feet per second on the y-axis. The blue circles are discharge values for the south to north flow. The red circles are discharge values for the north to south flow. And the north to south flow is underneath the south to north flow. So it's a bidirectional flow. And then the light gray line is the lake elevation difference between the north and the south arms based on the Saltair gauge and based on the saline gauge. We'll have a really long-term record. And so we have data going all the way back to 2016 when the new breach was opened. And so the blue circles are really high when the breach was open. There's a big head difference over near 3 feet, thousands of CFS of water moving from south to north, and no water moving the other direction. But I've talked in the past about these seasonal trends that we see going forward in time. And you can see that the difference between north and south flows based on these seasonal trends has kind of gotten more and more muted as the head difference, or excuse me, the elevation difference has decreased. So just to kind of give you a sense of what's happening right now, the most recent discharge measurements were made just a week ago, I think March 15th, a little more than a week ago, 2 weeks ago. They measured 1,060 CFS moving from the south to north, and then 156 CFS moving from north to south. So anyway, important data to help calibrate models at the new breach. All right, this is the point, I think, where Christine is going to take over. Are there any questions on what I've just shown?
I have one question.
Yes, sir.
After the Corinne Bridge, there's only like 3 water users that are taking water from the Bear River. And if you determine when they were taking water in the volume, that should be the same amount of water that's going beneath the causeway, isn't it?
Yes, but one of the water users is the Bear River Bird Refuge, and they have a huge water right, over 400,000 acre feet. And they really don't quantify how much water. I've had a couple phone conversations with them. They really don't quantify that very tightly, how much water they actually bring in from the Bear River. And then they also have drains where they release water back out. And not good math on that right now. So would be prudent maybe to think about some stream gauges on some of the drains that drain the Bear River Bird Refuge.
There's only a couple of points where they're taking water out of the river, though.
Yes, but they don't measure it.
Why don't you measure it
Yeah.
for free?
Just
Well, a
like
great
that.
suggestion.
Well, they're having
Sister
problem at the
agency.
Causeway Bridge. You gotta be able to determine it that way.
Say that again.
If you're having trouble measuring the amount of water that's flowing into the Great Salt Lake from the at the Causeway site, then the next best thing would be to calculate how much water is coming underneath the Bear River at Corinne, and then determine how much water the water users are taking from that. And those should be the same.
Yes, and we've made that suggestion, right, to Ashley and ecosystems, and so yeah, that's the angle.
But just one more point to clarify that, you're gonna have to account for the evaporative loss as it travels that distance from the refuge discharge points to the bridge. You've got quite an
Little
expansive
spur.
mudflat area there to lose water, both to groundwater and evaporation. So that would, what you're proposing, Mike, would give you a maximal value that you could see to go through from the Great Salt Lake, but not necessarily what's actually reaching.
It's a difficult problem for sure, but we can improve, definitely our estimates. So, all right,
There's any water to measure.
any other questions for me? Okay, perfect. Christine will take over. Thanks, Christine.
Okay, this is just to remind everyone, we conduct routine monitoring of the river influence for nitrogen, phosphorus, and we also measure density. So we do this at 6 sites when there's water: Beaver Bay, Weaver, Farmington Bay, Goggin, and at the New Breach. Lakeside's been dry since July of 2020, so we haven't got a sample there in a while. But we began this sampling program in 2011. Yep, and so then we partner with GSLEP here, and they collect samples at 4 sites on the lake to monitor nutrients and the water part of the system. We'll collect the samples at these 4 sites to depth, and we can capture the deep brine layer at 2565 of Carrington Bay, and then also Gilbert Bay, although I understand it's kind of disappeared there. And these are sampled every month, so we have a pretty temporally dense record of nutrients, although not capturing the nutrient dynamics. Maybe it's time to go, but pretty good. And again, we measure nutrients and density there. Okay. We're working on this paper. As you all know, it's been a challenge. Big massive timing. There's the business change hands a couple of times, but we have a plan in place. We're just going to update it up to the present. You know, originally it's going to go to 2018. We're just going to take it all the way to 2021, and we're just going to recreate it and hopefully get this out to everyone. Okay. Here is a record of density. We're looking at data from 2565 in Carrington Bay to 3510. So density measured at 20 degrees C on the y-axis over time, starting at about spring of 2010 present. The yellow orangey dots are Carrington Bay. Circles represent the deep brine layer, and then the triangles are the upper brine. 3510 during Gilbert Bay sites in purple. So you can kind of see how we are at 3510. The deep brine layer is disappearing. The upper brine and deep brine layer densities are converging. 2565, we still see the deep brine layer up there, and we continue to kind of increase in density over time. We did kind of reach a peak in our density values around here, and we kind of started to come back down with our most recent values being around 2 grams per cubic centimeter. And if we look at the next slide, we can look at what those values are for salinity, looking at 3510. Salinity in grams per liter on the y-axis, same time period. And I think you're all familiar with what these show. Densities, or sorry, salinities are, you know, within our range for the brine shrimp, but given the conditions, the inflow conditions Ryan just mentioned. See what this does. And I guess another thing to point out is that, you know, we've done this exercise of where the deep brine there mixes into the upper brine. You know, we might be seeing an increase in upper brine density as a result. Those 2 waters. So keep that in mind. Okay, so then I'll just kind of go through a few things we're working on at USGS that I think are relevant to this group. The first thing I'll touch on is the SALT study we're working on. Second would be the work plan. We're going to go through our proposed ideas for the work plan for FY23. And then we just kind of want to share the Great Salt Lake Hydro Mapper, which is a website that will be available to the public to come and share our data and the story of Great Salt Lake. Okay, so let's go back one slide. Starting with this SALT study, we kind of shared a few slides in the December meeting. This analysis was kind of born out of an exercise we did with the Salinity Advisory Committee and kind of working with Brine Shrimp Cooperative to just better understand salinity dynamics in the South Arm. And since then, we as a USGS group decided that it would be worthwhile for us to invest in this a little bit more at this time, given the lake level conditions and the importance of salinity that many of the stakeholders have expressed. So we have put this as kind of the top of our to-do list, is actually generated a publication where we're interrogating the data we have in greater detail. We're incorporating more sites for the analysis, and we are trying to offer some insight into salt dynamics in the South Arm. And this is also kind of supporting a hot topics grant that was funded last year to get at this very question. So kind of the main objectives of that effort, just so you're all aware, estimate the distribution of salt mass in upper brine and deep brine there, and many of you have seen preliminary estimates of that in the past. Secondly, to calculate the mass exchange at the new breach. So as we're seeing changes in salt mass in the South Arm over time, what could be driving that? And the new breach certainly affects that. And then finally, to determine the fraction of salt that's contributed by river inflows, just better understanding that magnitude that's contributed by freshwater. And just giving you some idea of kind of how we built out the analysis. In the past, we were only including data from 2565 and 3510, so those two sites, one in Carrington Bay, one in Gilbert Bay. Since then, we've decided to use all the GSLEP sites, so all the four sites that use all samples. And those data are shown in the lines here. So this plot is showing an estimate of mean monthly salt mass in megatons since monitoring began in 2010 to present. So the lines are showing the data used at your four sites. And we compared that to a number of different data sets. And sorry, I'll go through the colors. Total mass is black, the upper brine is in blue, and then we have our deep brine shown down here, and red is Carrington Bay, and the orange yellow is Gilbert Bay. So it's kind of what we're looking at. And then this gray line is the percent of mass held in the deep brine layer, which can fluctuate from 5 to 20% depending on lake conditions. But how we've added on to this is, again, doing the four sites, but then also adding in additional data sets that we've never looked at before. And one is this biennial sampling that the USGS does in cooperation with DEQ, where we go out in June and October every year and we collect samples at 7 sites in the South Arm. I excluded Farmington Bay, quite strange, but 7 sites. But I wanted to see, with the 4 sites we have monthly data at, that is a really nice temporal resolution. How does that compare to the data where we have at 7 sites, where we're capturing more spatial variability? And it does pretty well. I mean, it's all these estimates. You can see them in the dots here. They track the pattern, and all the estimates are within 10%, and most of them are lower than that. So we're encouraged that these 4 sites are capturing quite a bit of the spatial variability in the South Arm. And then we kind of added on a bunch of different combinations. What if we only looked at the breach, the south to north flow? What if we only looked at data from Saltair? To see the amount of variability, this can inform monitoring plans moving forward to say, okay, the only sample at the new breach, you're not capturing all the variability. And that's important information we feel to dig into to try and inform monitoring efforts. Okay, next slide. So, sorry, can we go back? I just want to point out this, as you all know, the salt mass is dynamic. It's changing over time. It's not just a fixed value. And from here to, from about when the breach opened in the end of 2016 to present, we kind of see this uptick over time. So a key question is, what's driving these changes, both the decreases and the increases? And so if we go to the next slide, we all are kind of looking to the new breach. We know there's water flux, there's salt mass flux happening there. So we're working to quantify that. These are estimates of that. So daily flux at the new breach from when it opened to present. The south to north salt mass flux is in green. You can see that huge drop when the breach opened. We had a 3-foot head difference from the south. So it was all flowing to the north. So a huge amount of salt mass lost during that time. And you can see how it fluctuates through time. And then the north to south estimate of salt mass transit is shown in the red. And these periods of gray hatching indicate where we're getting a net salt import from the north to south. So we're trying to explore, okay, does the new breach explain all the dynamics in the temporal pattern of salt mass in South Arm? And it actually does a pretty good job when we see decreases in that trend. We're able to say, okay, that corresponds to when the breach was open. There was X tons that was exported. We can account for it that way. We can't account for what's coming in. We're still working on that question. The amount of mass that's being being transported from north to south, kind of forming a deep brine and making its way to the south. It's not enough to account for the increases we're seeing in the south arm. So it's still a mystery we're digging into and hope to shed some light on moving forward. Okay, let's go to the next topic, which is the work plan, FY23. So we proposed 3 tasks. The first 2 are ones you've seen before, inflow monitoring at Gaga and Barracuda Bay. The second, funding the nutrient analyses. And the third is we're asking for additional funding to finish the phase 1 nutrient balance report. And as part of that, repeat the sediment track deployment to try and refine the uncertainty that we have from our first kind of effort at doing that. So I can kind of give you an update on this task 3, this nutrient mass balance report. Next slide. We've had a number of challenges. Number 1 being that we're still waiting on samples. So we did the sampling campaign in summer of 2020. We were relying on an external lab to process some of our samples. And they got hit super hard in COVID, and they just have not delivered what they said they would yet. So we are waiting, and these are cess-on samples, so trying to quantify nutrient mass in the phytoplankton, essentially. And we're still waiting on them. We've tried to do what we can for the data release. Here's kind of a snapshot of what that will look like. And again, this is going to house all of the data we've collected for sediment, for biota, water, sediment traps, et cetera, all the things. So we've compiled what we can. We've done a first cut review of it as part of our internal USGS review process. And once we can get this on data, I think we'll be able to crank on this pretty quickly and hopefully be able to publish it in the next few months. And then the interpretive analysis is in progress. And if we go to the next slide, I'll kind of explain why we wanted to repeat the sediment trap. So just checking in again with big picture objectives of what that nutrient mass balance study was. We're trying to understand the different pools of nutrients in the system. So where is the greatest mass of nitrogen and phosphorus held? In the sediments, in the water column, in the biota. And as part of this effort, it's like not only where are the nutrients, but how are they moving from one pool to the next? And one way we wanted to get at that was to look at this particulate nutrient deposition through the use of sediment traps. So estimating the rate at which particulate matter is settling through the water column, measuring the nutrient content of that and the rate at which it's settling and making it to the lake bottom. We can also compare that to an estimate of mass accumulation rate in the bottom sediment, based on kind of work that Dave Nass has done in the past and estimated concentrations of nutrients in the sediment. We can say, okay, here's how much we expect the nutrients to actually be accumulating at any given site. Let's compare that to what's actually falling down, what we'd expect there to be if there was kind of no biological processes happening in the sediment, and try and get at some evidence of, do we observe that there's some recycling of nutrients back into the water? So we deployed these sediment traps at 4 sites in the lake as shown here. Here's kind of a mock-up of what they look like. A paired trap in the upper brine and a paired trap in the deep brine layer. Just kind of showing you what they look like in actuality and what they look like if they pull them up. And I'll show you some preliminary data on the next slide. The challenge we found is that the uncertainty in these measurements is really high. So here I'm estimating the nutrient mass deposition rate. And so the green and the kind of red are, okay, what's falling out of the water column? What's the rate of that deposition through the water column? And you can see there's just massive uncertainty bars just that deal with, our familiarity with learning how to deal with these water samples and how to extract particulate matter from them. It's a very challenging process. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and we compare that to the sediment burial rate at the bottom of the lake. So when these diverge, when we see that basically nutrients are falling out of the water column faster than they're accumulating here, that's saying to me there's some evidence that there's nitrogen being recycled back into the water column. It's undergoing some process, chemical process, biological process in the sediment, and then becoming potentially biologically available again in the water column after that recycling. But to really, that's kind of I want to make sure we get it right, and it's clear that we have high uncertainty, So that's why I'm proposing that we try this again. And we try to resolve these uncertainty bands to try and just see if this is correct and just verify it. So that's part of what we propose in the work plan. And then finally, I'll just share the hydromapper with you. I'm sure many of you have seen this. And this is coming along really nicely. We'll be sharing more information about this at the Great Salt Issues Forum. But the basic idea is to provide kind of a space, a place for the public to access Great Salt Lake data. So lake levels, current salinity conditions, and then this Great Salt Lake water dashboard includes, it kind of zooms out and it provides information for the watershed. So river inflows, snow tell stations, soil moisture data, just to help people get a bigger sense of how Great Salt Lake fits into a bigger watershed picture. And then I think one of the coolest parts of this whole exercise is Toby Wellborn and Shannon Watermelon have worked on this. They took the Salt Lake Comprehensive Management Plan, is that correct? And they kind of put lake levels in context of all these beneficial uses of Great Salt Lake. So the public can go to this resource matrix and say, okay, how does the current lake level affect wetlands? How does it affect various economic, industrial activities? How does it affect, wildlife? So just so you're all aware that this is another initiative USGS is currently working on and hoping to get out. So I think that's all of that.
Christina, your proposal with the sediment traps, are you planning to do exactly the same as you did last time, or are you changing the methodology?
Yes, we'd like to change the methodology. So the challenge is like we had the highest uncertainty in the deep brine. The deep brine is disappearing, so it's going to be hard to like exactly replicate that. But I'd like to deploy it at one site with the DBL to try and get that comparison again. But then I think I want to do it at a site without the DBL. It's a little less challenging. We know that we can measure it a little bit better. But then again, compare it to this lake bottom sediment at that given site. And I'm thinking probably the site that's kind of near Bear River Bay. But anyway, and we also need to think about how to better separate the particulate matter from the water. And so that's what I need to think about. Previously, we were using kind of a USGS standard protocol, which used a 25 millimeter filter. It's just not enough. I mean, when you can only filter 20 mils, it's not a representative sample, and there's a ton of variability. So I've got to think of a way to be able to filter a bigger water sample, or somehow freeze dry it. Just a better way to really get that material harvested from the water, from the sediment trap. And maybe Gary has some. I'll take his brain. Okay.
We did have a question from Krishna.
Okay.
Since there are several empty reservoirs upstream of the gauge stations, can we get some gauge stations performances upstream in the future presentation that may represent the natural flow situation and recent hydrologic performances?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
That'll be available on the dashboard.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's available now, right? And
Okay.
you all can go to the best thing to do now is just Google the National Water Dashboard. That's the way that's the direction USGS is going for displaying real-time data. And it brings up a map of the country. You can zoom in on Utah. It defaults to showing stream gauge locations. You just click on the location of interest, and you can drill into all the data for a given gauge that you select. And like Laura said, on the hydromapper, we'll make that even a little more convenient, where the water dashboard will be narrowed down to just the Great Salt Lake Basin, and just go through the same exercise.
All right. No further questions.
Anybody else here have any questions?
Just gonna say to Christine that your sediment traps, the lake level is dropped, getting a lot more sediment. You might have too much data.
Good to
But
know.
you'll get a lot more.
Okay.
Every windstorm we get is sediment. We have a hypothesis that sediment turbidity is probably gonna influence phyto production. Because I can cell exposure. So lots of stuff.
All right, so Riley couldn't make it. I'm gonna ask Ben if he remembers, because I know you semi-updated us at our staff meeting a little bit on some of the legislative bills, and if you can, and I was gonna ask Laura as well, if she had some insight to that. And it would have been nice to have Tim here on Tim Hawk's Acknowledgement and Appreciation Day, because, but he's not here either, so. Do you, all right.
Rundown of legislative bills impacting Great Salt Lake.
Yeah, if possible.
All right. We'll start with the big one, HB 410, Speaker Wilson's bill that allocated $40 million to create the Great Salt Lake watershed enhancement program. And that allocates about $30 million to water rights acquisition and about $10 million to watershed projects to improve watershed health in Great Salt Lake. HB 33 was Representative Ferry's bill, which allows now the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands and others to hold industry flow rights for the purpose of the Great Salt Lake. And this is where I forget the numbers of the bills. So I'll just talk about them in title. There is the Great Salt Lake Amendments Bill that allocates $5 million to the Division of Water Resources to do a Great Salt Lake watershed assessment. So earlier you guys were talking about monitoring of water going into Bear River, for example. So this will be a watershed look at the condition and health of the watershed, also where the flows are going, maybe hopefully help to allow us to start to identify areas where we could have additional monitoring points where those are most needed, so we can start tracking where all this water is going or not going. And forgetting I'm excited about a couple of the Forestry, Fire, and State Land specific bills. One of them is the Sovereign Lands Management Account. Tim Hawks ran this bill that basically says that for all of the royalties that are generated on Great Salt Lake, in the past they've been used to fund things like the state fair or sage grouse restoration or keeping national parks open when there's a government shutdown. But now that those funds in that restricted account are specifically dedicated to sovereign lands. So all that money will go back into sovereign lands projects related to sovereign lands, water rights to benefit sovereign lands, things like that. So we also, thanks to Representative Hawks, now we have $150,000 ongoing for management of sovereign lands, which we've never had before. As a land management agency, we had no land management budget. So now we have things to just like put up a gate to prevent people from dumping tires along the freeway. So exciting projects are going to be happening there. We also have, thanks to Representative Owens, a new law enforcement officer for the Great Salt Lake. For all of the sovereign land bodies across the state, we only had one sovereign lands officer. And so now we have two to help us with Great Salt Lake issues. And that was stemming from, I guess, Representative Owens' interest in motorized use, or making sure we decrease motorized vehicle use on Great Salt Lake lake bed to minimize dust. So.
And when does that person come on, or have they?
We have not even begun recruiting for that yet. Oh, and then I should say, in the governor's budget, it was passed without any question. My request, or building block request, to update our comprehensive management plan for the matrix that Christine mentioned. We're going to dive a little deeper into that and look at lower lake levels, what the management implications are at lower lake levels, and then also we have about $200,000 for education and outreach. So we have opportunities to expand outreach opportunities, and that the importance of Great Salt Lake. And wait, there's one more that just came to me. And there's several indirectly related bills, but I guess this one is pretty direct. This was actually ARPA funds that were allocated in the fall of 2021. We had $5 million allocated to implement the adaptive management features of the breach, and also to dredge the salt air marina so we can get boats out. But we are in the process of working through those two projects right now. And the last one I'll mention is kind of direct, but it's $250 million for the Division of Water Resources to install secondary water meters on meters across the state. But I mean, we're focused on the Great Salt Lake watershed and how that will have an impact on secondary water use.
So on that, the breach, what is the time frame? Are we still looking at June for that, or?
It's possible. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sure we'll find out more.
Yeah, so there's a salinity advisory committee meeting on next week on April 6th. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. As you all know, the salinity advisory committee made a recommendation to DNR and DEQ to modify the breach, and DNR and DEQ are looking at what that entails right now. And so we're hoping by the salinity advisory committee meeting to have perhaps a more well-articulated response to the salinity advisory committee, and some more updates at that meeting. And then it's a matter of hiring someone to do the work. But we do realize that timing will be important, given runoff, given temperature, all the things you guys are talking about. So we want to make sure that we do it at the right time, as soon as we can.
All right.
Lynn DeFrida said there's also a bill that covers the cost for 3 additional people in the Division of Water Rights, one of which will be focusing on GSL water-related issues.
Yeah, Teresa Wilhelmsen will have a new deputy director that will focus on Great Salt Lake.
Lots of things going on in the legislature this year.
The
So,
year of water, but I like to call it the year of Great Salt Lake.
yeah, yeah. It's a bonus year. Anybody else have any questions or anything they want to mention? Other than probably Lynn would like to also mention the Issues Forum, which is coming up in May the
18th, 19th, 20th.
18th, 19th, and 20th.
Yay, thank you.
I can't hear you. I wonder why. Let me-
Hmm.
Huh.
Hmm. Can you hear me now?
Can you turn on your
Well, that's
volume?
kind of a bonus,
Oh.
actually, if you can.
Hello, testing 1, 2, 3.
We got you. We got you.
Yay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I am looking forward to all of you at the forum, May 18th through 20th. And thank you for your commitments to be on the program and sponsorships. So, you know, yeah, let's go for it.
Awesome, thanks, Lynn. Okay, so before we close here, I will mention, just like Ryan said, there's a new work plan or being put together to address the Christine went over. So we're going to work on getting that approved. Same thing goes, I believe I mentioned last time about the bioenergetic model. We have been also submitted that for approval from our director's office. So we're just waiting for word on whether or not those things are going to be able to be funded. So, and I'll work on additional funding for those as well. So just wanted to mention that as kind of an update on previous meetings, but we're moving forward, I guess, is the best thing to say about that. And I'll hopefully by August, the August tag, I'll know what's going on with both of those. So I'll be able to update you then.